To step out for a call at 6:30, so I'm trying to sit in a place where I won't disrupt you now.
Thank you. Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm going to interrupt this great energetic conversation and welcome you all to the launch of the second Absa Africa Financial Markets Index. I've got to tell you, this is not as exotic as last week. We did this in Bali. George had a grass skirt on. I'll never try and describe what Jeff had on, because even we couldn't work that out. It had a very exotic look. Now, on a more serious note, when we did this the first time in the US, in Washington a year ago, we said that we want to ensure that It's something that adds real value to what policymakers, to what central bankers and others, market participants, think about how we develop our capital markets. You will all recall that it's been in an era where de-risking by certainly the large global banks has become the norm. And I spend a lot of my time with regulators and finance ministers, and they've been very clear about wanting to develop a level of independence whilst being interdependent in order to make sure that we can move from being always kind of the recipients of to being real participants in. So when we did the first one, and that was actually quite successful, George and Garth, who had bushwhacked me to fund this thing, said, well, you've got to do it again and again and again. And I've got to say to you, it was one of the better decisions that we made. Fortunately for us, we were partnered by OMFIF, the official market, monetary, financial institution, OMFIF. It sounds great when you say OMFIF because they've got a lot of oomph about them. And it's intellectual oomph. It's not fluffy oomph. And the reason I say that, I mean, Danae is going to come in and talk to you and take you through some of the details just now. One of the most endearing memories I'm going to have is one of our panelists was the governor of the Central Bank of Ghana. And somewhere during his speech, commentary, his microphone started sliding down the slide. And David, who's the chairman of OMFIF, leaned across and was kind of fiddling with it and almost playing with it like a violin. And you could see the governor getting increasingly irritated but not being able to say so. So I must say to you that he had lots of oomph that day. But fortunately, what the governor said was the following. They'd been able to look at this and use it in a manner that was constructive for the Ghanaian market, which has been one of the better developing markets for us. So I'm very excited about what Danae and George, and I'm going to call them up in a minute to say. Let me finish by saying that we've got 20 in the index today. Whilst we were there were a number of countries that came and wanted to know. Malawi was one of them. Why they were not included. And so clearly there's a desire for this to be expanded. And all I can say to you is we're committed to doing so, and hopefully it drives the right kind of policies and behaviors. So I'm going to ask Beauty and the Beast to come up and take you through the details. George and Danae, please take me out of my misery. Oh, by the way, I was told to say there's this hashtag thing. I'm too old to know what it means. But please tweet and say what a great thing this is, right? I want to be able to say to my kids, I was also on Twitter media, or whatever they call it. So enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Peter. So you've had the entertainment. Now comes the serious part of going through the actual results of the index. We are economists here, but it's a very interesting subject. And also to echo what Peter has been saying, it's also a privilege to be here and to have partnered with Absa on this. We think it's a very important endeavor for the continent. And really, there's two things that we want out of this index as Absa and OMFIF. One is relevance. We want this to be relevant to the policymakers, to be able to see what are the areas that they should focus on in terms of moving to this next stage of development, of developing capital markets and the financial system more broadly. Also relevant for the investor side. When you're looking to invest in a market, what are the kind of things that you're looking for? Economic growth, there's a lot of indicators out there for that, ease of doing business. But in terms of the capital markets, this is the gap that we're really trying to fill here for investors to be able to distinguish and see what are the different countries have to offer. And the second thing we want to achieve with this index is accuracy, because this is something that we've struggled with in some of the conversations that we've had. Some countries come to us and say, well, actually, we want to be higher in the position, and it creates a little bit of competition. But for us as researchers, it's really about being accurate and having the views of both the market and the policymakers represented in how this index is constructed. So in addition to the hard data that we measure, things that, for example, what kind of products are available on a stock exchange, we also get investors' views. We survey around 50 different institutions, both on the investment side and the policy side, accountancy firms as well, in order to give us this really balanced view of what is going on, because it's all well for a central bank to say we've implemented these great policies, but we want to see what the impact that has. And it has led to some conversation where there isn't always agreement, and that's where we see our role as coming in as an independent, joint partners in assessing that in a very independent and credible way. So these are the two main things that we want to achieve with this index. We want it to be useful, relevant, and also accurate. So I'll take you through the index as a whole, how it's set up, how we've constructed it, and then I'll go into detail in some of the pillars, and I'll hand over to George, who has been leading this on the Absa side. So looking at the final results of what the index looked like this year, and it might be hard to read here, but this is all in your report. I think this is page 5, where you have the list of the different countries and the results. So the index is set up by looking at 6 different pillars of what we think are important for the development of capital markets. So we have a pillar on market depth, so liquidity, turnover, what kind of availability of products we have, diversity of products. Then we have the pillar on access to foreign exchange. So if you're an investor looking to invest in an African market, what kind of transparency is there in the foreign exchange market? How liquid is the interbank foreign exchange turnover? How open are capital markets? Are there capital controls? What kind of exchange rate regime they have? Then we have a pillar on the tax and regulatory regime and market transparency. So what level of implementation of for example, Basel requirements or IFRS are the different countries at. We have the capacity of local investors. So is there enough capacity to absorb liquidity even for an investor who wants to exit the market, for example? How big are the institutional investors in the country in terms of pension funds and their assets? We look at the macroeconomic environment, not just the economic growth, but also how transparent are the different economies. Do they report their budget regularly? Do they report the outcomes of their monetary policy committee meetings regularly? How competitive are their exports? And finally, we have the legality and enforceability of financial markets agreements. So what are the insolvency frameworks, for example, and what level of implementation they are there. So these are the 6 pillars that make up the index, and these are the headline results. You also see the results of last year. This year we added 3 new countries, Angola, Cameroon, and Senegal, so it's not really possible to compare this year's results with last year's because there have been some new entrants, but it's still possible to see some broad trends. So South Africa is still at the top, but it's lost a little bit of its performance. It's weakened its performance compared to last year, especially on the Pillar 2 and Pillar 3. We'll go into that in more detail. There have been some challenges in terms of its macroeconomic opportunity as well. We've seen some movement in the overall performance of the country. So we've seen countries such as Kenya, Nigeria move up. Countries like Mauritius or Namibia, which are still ranking very highly, move down. Other countries further down that have moved up, like Seychelles, for example. And it's really about assessing how the progress has been from one year to the next. That's the other value of the index, for countries to be able to benchmark their performance against their peers, but also against themselves. Because we expect to always keep seeing South Africa at the top, that it is the most developed financial market in the continent, but how does it do compared to what it was doing last year? So that's another interesting takeaway that we hope the report has to offer. So here you can look for the different countries. There is more detail on how they've been doing. And then on the next page, you also see how they're doing on each individual pillar. And here you can really see that there is one way to be at the top. So South Africa does very well on all 6 pillars, but there's many ways to come perhaps in the middle or do less well. So, for example, Botswana does very well on pillars 2 to 6, but it has an average or close to average score when it comes to the market depth, pillar 1. Or Mauritius, which does very well on most pillars, in fact, better than Botswana in some, it has a very low level for capacity of local investors, below average. So again, you can see that there is this detail of the different 6 pillars allows policymakers and investors to really look what are the gaps, what are the quick things that we can fix with each of these policies that we can put in place. So overall, when we compared how countries did with last year compared with this year, we saw some improvement. A lot of economies are putting in place policies to improve the development of financial markets. The Twin Peaks regulation, for example, here in South Africa, separating the regulation. Also, some countries moving towards more open markets, more flexible exchange rates, reducing capital controls. So overall, there is a willingness to open financial markets, and as you will read in the forwards that some of our partners have written, Jing Donghua from the IFC, for example, or President Adesina from the Africa Development Bank, as well as Maria Ramos, they all highlight the importance of capital markets in really financing and bringing us to this next stage of the development of the African continent. There's never really been a story of markets growing without efficient capital markets. In the same way that you have social infrastructure, that you have physical infrastructure, you also need the capital markets to really connect the savings to investment opportunities and enable countries to grow and have more funding opportunities domestically. So this year we also have an interactive data bank. This is something that you can go online and play with, and it gives you so much more detail than what is in the report. There is so much that we could put into the 35 pages of the report. This is not in the report itself. That's the whole point, that it's something that you can go and play around with online. So we had so many data points. We looked at over 60 indicators, and the pillar scores gives you the summary of that. But the way that you can play with this is that you can select a country and you can go after each pillar and see how it's doing on the individual indicators within the pillar. So I'll show you an example. So you go there and you scroll down the list of countries. So we're selecting Ghana in this example. Once you click on Ghana, you see where it stands on each pillar. So you can see that it's quite a varied performance. So Ghana is one of those that's somewhere in the middle of the index. And then you can also go and see how it's doing on each of the different pillars. So that then brings up how it's doing in terms of product diversity, in terms of the size of markets, liquidity, depth, and so on. So the different indicators that make up this pillar. Macroeconomic opportunity, similarly, you can see the different indicators that make this up. We also have the 2 boxes on the side that show the strengths and improvements for each country. So if you're interested in any particular country, you can go and read about where it did well, where it didn't do so well. And you can also easily see the comparison with another country. So Ghana and Zambia are very close in their overall score. But when you click on Zambia, you can see the makeup is very different to that of Ghana. So even though they're very close in the overall results, they are doing very differently in terms of the individual pillars. So we hope that this interactive data bank is also a way for people to engage with the index and to be able to look into more detail. And we hope that you will all use that and give us also some feedback, because for us, it's also important to see how you use this. We want this to be a very interactive index. So you can access this by clicking on the link to download the report. It will take you to a place to get a digital copy of the report as well as access the data bank. So I'll go quickly now through the first few pillars. So pillar 1 is looking at market depth. So how deep and liquid are financial markets in Africa? So you have South Africa and Nigeria doing very well there. Nigeria especially has implemented some policies to improve market access. I'll move on to that in the next slide. But you can see that it's one of the pillars where there is quite a bit of gap between the first and the second country and the rest. There is quite a big cluster in the middle. When we look at the pillars overall, Pillar 3 tends to be the one that does best, and Pillar 5, where countries do tend to perform well, and then Pillar 4, which is the capacity of local investors, tends to be the one that is most challenging for most countries on the index. But Pillar 1, we have a fairly big cluster in the middle. Looking at how countries changed from last year to another, to this year, there were some changes in terms of policy. So some countries were lowering barriers to enable new companies to enter the stock exchange. There was also some innovation in terms of bringing new products. In the case of Ghana, for example, introducing the real estate investment trusts. There was also innovation in terms of the way participants were allowed to access the market. So, for example, the online trading platforms that Nigeria introduced. And we can see the biggest risers as well being Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia. On the other hand, you had some negative developments as well. Some countries trying to implement policies that they thought would help the market, but it's also about finding the right timing and understanding what may be the unintended consequences of some policies in some cases. So in the case of Tanzania, for example, requiring these companies to list on the local stock exchange and float their shares to local investors, but when you don't have enough take-up by the local investors, this kind of policy can fail. So some examples of what we saw happening over the last year. Pillar 2 is looking at the access to foreign exchange. So what are the factors that determine foreign investors' capacity and ability to deploy and repatriate capital into a market? Because it might be very well that Ethiopia is the fastest growing economy, but if you're a foreign investor and you want to invest, there is no stock exchange, there's only a commodity exchange, for example. Or if there is the opportunity to invest in a foreign market, but the foreign exchange has multiple rates, one that you see and one that is different, then that can also be an obstacle. Capital controls as well, some countries that still have high capital controls, or exchange rate regimes that do not encourage foreign investment can also be an issue. So these are the things that we look at in this second pillar, as well as the liquidity, so the interbank foreign exchange turnover, and also the ratio of portfolio flows to reserves. So South Africa, for example, was the top country in this pillar before. Now Kenya overtook it and is ranking first, which was one of the interesting findings of this year's results. But it highlights the vulnerability that sometimes open capital markets bring. We saw what happened in South Africa in the summer. It is one of the most liquid emerging markets globally. So when you're so open to foreign capital and foreign investment, that can also be a challenge when suddenly you have capital outflows and the willingness of investors to be in the market reverses. So there needs to be a balance with central banks and other policymakers preparing for that event through building foreign exchange reserves, for example, at the central bank. So that's very important, how you balance the opening of the capital markets without making the market vulnerable to sudden outflows or investment reversals. And that's something that we saw a lot of survey participants highlight as well when we talked to them about that. But they all generally agreed that yes, there are risks with opening to foreign investment, but at the same time, it is necessary for the long term to do so, and you cannot develop until you do. So even though there are risks, there are vulnerabilities that this brings, it is very important that we set the right infrastructure to be able to allow investors to come from abroad. So here we saw some policies that countries introduced in terms of opening up their capital markets. So a few countries moved to liberalize their exchange rate regimes, for example, moving from fixed exchange rate regimes to floating ones. In some cases, as you see with Egypt, that can lead to sudden movements in inflation or on the exchange rate, which can lead to short-term vulnerabilities in the economy. But in the longer term, capital markets help create more stable financial conditions. At the same time, in terms of reporting of exchange rates, Ivory Coast and Ethiopia moved towards single exchange rates, boosting the element of transparency. And looking at the top risers, we had Seychelles, Kenya, and Zambia, who helped liberalize and open their capital markets the most. The third pillar looks at the market transparency, tax and regulatory environment. Again, interesting results here. Nigeria overtaking South Africa due to a number of policies that they've implemented to harmonize the tax rates and also bring more tax transparency. But overall here you see that it's a pillar where a lot of countries do fairly well. If you think how the pillar 2 and pillar 1 were looking, this is one where we generally tend to have high scores. And there tends to be not as much variation. You have some countries that are lagging behind, but even Ethiopia is doing better here than it's doing in other pillars. And looking at the risers and fallers and the policies that were introduced over the last year, so we have Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast improving, some countries moving from permitted but not required to required in terms of the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards with Ivory Coast and Mozambique. Also in the case of Basel implementation, some countries moving from Basel I to Basel II to Basel III, so there is progress there, but there's still some countries that are lagging behind. So I'll pass on to George here to take you to the rest of the pillars, and then I'm sure there will be a lively discussion in the panel, but we'll also be outside to answer any more questions after the event finishes.
Thank you. So I guess beauty is done. Yeah, but thank you all for coming today. So I'm going to run through the rest of the pillars. And the next pillar, which is quite interesting, is the pillar on capacity of local investors. And the question is, why is this important for a financial markets? We've realized that, as we mentioned, if a financial market is open to foreign investors and it gets to a point where a foreign investor needs to exit the market, it's important to have a backstop, which will normally come through participation from local investors. Then in the context of Africa, we've also realized that increasingly there are policies that try to promote domestic ownership of African investments. So if you go to Namibia or you go to Tanzania, or recently you've seen in Ghana, governments are passing policies that says that if there is any instrument that is issued on the market, whether it's on the stock exchange, whether it's a bond, they want local participation to go up. But what we've actually seen in reality, whether Tanzania or Ghana or Namibia, is that there has been issuances in the market, so securities have been issued on the stock exchanges, equities have been issued through IPOs, and the local take-up has been very weak. And that talks to the amount of capacity or the amount of muscle that local investors have to be able to carry the market, either to implement government policy or to be able to buffer when foreign investors are exiting the market. And one of the things that we discovered in the year of review was the misalignment between what policy makers think they do in the market versus what investors within the market want to be done. So in a lot of the markets, you have investors that are very keen and want to invest in products. And then on the other side, you may have a policymaker who implements a policy that goes against what the investor is trying to do. So we've seen a couple of markets where products have been rolled out, but because of policies, investors are unable to access those products. So that is one side, the policy deficiency. And then the second part has to do with education, which is also discovered in this pillar, where in many instances you also see policies are actually flexible to allow investors to do what they want to do. So you go to places like Kenya, and the policies are quite flexible for investors to be able to invest in different products to diversify their income and to grow returns. But then you see trustees and people who manage risk within the corporate environment are not up to speed in terms of understanding what products to implement and how to manage their risk by accessing financial market products. So in this pillar, there are two things that are a focus. The first thing talks about pension fund holdings of issued investment in the market. And then the second one talks about the pension fund per capita for all the markets. And it's important to also recognize that this pillar was the pillar where most of the countries actually had a very low ranking or low marks. And therefore, it presents a lot of opportunities in terms of what Africa can do to boost local participation in its markets. On the details of this pillar, you will see things that have been done in various markets to really promote local participation in the financial market. So we've already mentioned what South Africa has done, for example, by increasing the foreign ownership of South African fund the fund management sector within South Africa, increasing foreign ownership outside Africa from 25% to 30%, and then the foreign ownership in the rest of Africa from 5% to 10%. And we think things like that are very important because it enables fund managers to diversify their risk, and in times of turbulence in local markets, they are able to still achieve better returns for the funds that they control within the market. We've also seen things being done in markets like Uganda, where they've passed an integrated financial market strategy that pulls all the sectors together and importantly focuses on financial inclusion. So those are really good policies that have been introduced in some markets, which we believe other markets can adopt as well. Then we've seen policies in Nigeria, for example, which have also promoted a diversification strategy within the Nigerian system. So previously, pension funds couldn't access derivative market to be able to hedge their risk, but now they can. But then on the other side, there is a cap on how much you can access in the domestic market if you are a pension fund in Nigeria, which then works against the pension fund sector, and it's also something that Nigeria probably need to focus on. Then you go to Kenya, there are some investment vehicles available, but then you look at the range of investment vehicles available in Kenya, and you compare to South Africa, and it's basically dwarfed in that respect. So there is a need for Kenya and Kenyan market players to really invest in the range of products that investment managers can invest in. If you look at the top risers, I've already mentioned Nigeria, big policy changes that have happened there, and you can see what that has caused in terms of moving Nigeria 6 points on this pillar. Morocco has done a similar thing to Nigeria. Then you come to places like Mauritius, where there is limited product for pension funds to actually invest in, and that impacts Mauritius almost instantaneously. Tanzania is a space to watch. There's been some policies that have been implemented in the pension fund sector. We are not sure how that is going to pan out. I think it's something to watch for the future. But for now, it doesn't look like actually promoting local investments. Then there is the pillar on macroeconomic opportunity that talks about not just the growth of individual markets to an investor, but also talks about the quality of growth that different markets go through, as well as the transparency around the growth. So what investors have increasingly said is that, yes, Africa is growing very fast, but we understand the growth. And this is exactly what this pillar tries to measure. And the key things here is that, yes, Africa is a growth play, but it is important that for this growth to be sustained over the medium term, Africa must diversify, right? And then there also need to be a lot of investment in infrastructure as well. And the critical point is about transparency around the growth numbers. So we measure things like growth itself, measure things like debt profile, measure things like macroeconomic data publication, and then there is also data release and MPC outcome transparency. So here again, you can see South Africa offers a best practice, but an interesting thing that is developed here over the past 1 year has been Egypt. So Egypt has basically crawled out of a massive kind of slowdown in the economy into a moderate realm. And as they were migrating from the depression in the market into a growth phase, what they've done is actually transform the whole data supply to the macroeconomic system. So to investors have much more transparency, whether it's around MPC results, whether it's around budget numbers, etc. Egypt has done a lot of work. And we've seen, as you see here, Egypt has actually moved by 10 points. And I think this offers another opportunity for other countries to follow what Egypt has done. We've seen a similar trend in Morocco, which is also building up quite fast. We've seen South Africa slip slightly, and it's mainly driven by the fact that South Africa went into a bit of a recession. And then countries like Mozambique also suffered a bit because, as you all know, they went through a debt crisis, and that really impacts the investment case for a country like Mozambique. Then the last pillar is one that is really critical, and it talks really about property rights across the continent. And I think, as you can see, the shape is not looking as great as you saw in, let's say, a pillar 3 or maybe a pillar 1. I mean, what this pillar actually tells us is that in a lot of instances within the continent, when you execute transactions, the certainty about your right to the transaction is actually not guaranteed, which impacts on your ability to execute a transaction in a market or not. If you want to put it another way, it tells you that the risk of executing transactions across the continent is basically exaggerated, right? So to give you an instance, if you execute a spot transaction, your normal risk should be like 5%. But in the case of Africa, for countries that haven't sorted out their legal regime to ensure enforcement and respect for property rights, that risk moved from 5% to 95%, right? And these are opportunities for African economies to really solve some of these issues. And once you solve it, your risk profile actually comes down significantly, and liquidity and everything else will follow. So if you look into this particular pillar, we talk about things like the netting position and netting enforcement across the countries. We look at collateral enforcement across the countries, look at standard master agreement adoption within the countries, and importantly, you look at your insolvency framework as well. And as you can see, it's only about 4 countries where you have real certainty that if you execute a financial market transaction, your property rights will be respected. So looking at it again, it shows a couple of things, and I'm just going to mention 2. The first one is that it is the pillar where we saw the least change, okay, which also tells you that trying to solve legal issues doesn't take overnight. It's really not a low-hanging fruit. But it's important for us to throw light on so that anything that needs to be done around the legal framework within these countries have to be started now. Okay? Countries where this has been done and been done quite well, I can cite, South Africa, Nigeria, Namibia. Recently, we've seen some developments in Ghana, but it's not going as fast as the market would like to see it. And then you see countries like Rwanda also doing a lot to be able to turn things around when it comes to respect for property rights. So I would end there, but I would also want to mention that the discussions around this index and the power of contributions that come into through that discussion is continuing. The South Africa one is just one of them. After South Africa, we have roundtables across the continent together with market participants, the regulators, and the stock exchanges to really dive deep into some of these pillars and agree on what countries need to focus on for the next 12 months so that their ratings and rankings could be improved. Thank you very much.
Danae, George, thank you very much. Some fascinating insights. Good evening, everyone. I'm Adrian Saville. I'm professor at the Business School and also the director of the Center for African Management and Markets. And it's my pleasure, privilege to host the panel discussion this evening. You're not here to hear me, you're here to hear the panelists. So if you guys can join me. Whilst they making themselves comfortable, there's some spot prizes this evening. They are. Katie, who helped organize the function with Fiona, just don't know that they're spot prizes. How many countries are there in Africa? 54? Okay. Will anyone give me more than 54? 55. Who says 55? Yeah, and it is? What's the 55th? South Sudan? Western Sahara. Western Sahara. Most people think there's 54. We might agree that there's 55. If I told you one of these panelists had visited quite a few of these countries, how many would be a lot? Someone here has been to a lot of them. 35, 20, 23, 24? Can anyone beat 48? No. One of them's been to 48. Who do you think it is? Round of applause. Oh boy, okay, I wasn't invited to do a game show, but I'm absolutely intrigued that Riyadh has been to 48 of the 54 or 55 countries. So you get the first question. I was equally surprised that the 4 or 5 he hadn't been to include Angola,
Sudan, Namibia,
Botswana.
Yeah.
You
know, I moved recently to South Africa and I started enjoying the southern of the Africa.
So some of the remainder is easily bankable. We can get you there by Monday. And back. And back. Okay. You guys have the bios. It's not my job to do bios. You've read them. Each one of these is a rich, expert, experienced bio, and I'd like to draw on that as we go through our conversation. Before we go in there, to make a very serious point, and perhaps to make my opening observation on this index that you've built. If you come through, or as you go out the main doors of the GIBS building this evening, on the front sliding doors we have a map of Africa. And this maps each of the 55 countries, which is what leads us to suspect that there are 55, according to what I've come to call the six-pack. More correctly, the six-pack are 6 factors that in our research at the school we have identified as DNA markers of future prosperity. That if you've got lots of these components, you've been blessed. You might have blessed yourself, but you've put yourself into the running. The strongest six-packer, as we've come to colloquially call them, isn't in your index. It's Cape Verde. Yeah. So maybe that can become number 21 if you've got the budget, Peter. Also a nice holiday destination. And of the 6 components, one of the key components is a savings investment component, which then directly references your index work or corresponds with your index work. If we look at the way that this index is put together, and possibly I can start with you. Having traveled to 48 of the 55, no doubt you've got anecdotal observations that either confirm or question the results you see here.
Thank you very much. And let me first please thank Absa for this fantastic initiative. You know, I was in the office a few hours ago, and I'm going to visit Angola soon. And we started working because now we are able, and we got the green line to start working in a country like Angola, and we start working on building the strategy. And then I took the document, this very nice Absa Africa Financial Market Index, and I went to the last page, and I went to Angola. It's a very nice dashboard. You know, it's 2-page, but data is so complicated and tough to get in Africa that makes those 2-page extremely useful and relevant. So thank you for this initiative, and we started already benchmarking. You know, this is the second one. So we start making some assessment that we are progressing in some topics and not in other topics. Thank you very much for this initiative. I think the financial market need this kind of initiative and leadership, and thanks for Absa for doing this and for inviting IFC to this important event. So Africa, when we talk all the times about Africa everywhere in many forums, but you know, if you look at it's not here the ranking, the slide in the ranking, you will be impressed by seeing that the gap between the highest...
Thank you.
The first slide. No, the first one.
One more, there we go.
You will be impressed by, here we have only 20 from the 55, and you will be impressed by the gap between the first rate and the last one. It's almost 70 points. So this gives you an idea about that. Africa is not one block. It's different from one country to another. I was sharing my views. You know, when you go to West Africa, you find a very open economic space where the central bank manage 8 countries having the same currency, free movement of people and goods. And you find in those 8 countries one of the poorest economy like Guinea-Bissau and one of the highest growth economy in the world, which is Cote d'Ivoire. It's like the elephant and the mouse. And you can understand that it's really tough to regulate as one central bank these, let's say, contrast in terms of economic situations. But what I learned in Africa, wherever we are, I think we have many challenges, and the most important thing is to know that also, despite that, the fact we have challenging in our economies, we are facing local currency volatility, we are facing increasing in the interest, we are facing lots of economic growth uncertainty. There is some recession or lost growth that give and make these kind of reports extremely relevant, because the solution will remain our local market and our capabilities to develop our local markets to fund our economies. And this is what makes this economy relevant. But it's very important to don't forget that despite that, we have many, many challenges in Africa, traveling from Cape Verde, which is maybe one of the best governance in Africa in terms of managing the countries, to Guinea-Bissau, to Kenya, to Republic Democratic of Congo. It's really like you are traveling from one continent to another. But wherever you go in those countries, you find a very dynamic private sector that wake up every morning, try to fight, to create incomes, to feed their kids, and to send their kids to the schools. And you find around this lots of innovation. One of the topics that I would like to add to this discussion today, it's how digital financial services can play a huge bridge in filling the gap of the financial infra, and why we can see that many countries here, they can really grow very fast by making effectively the use of digital financial services in making new dynamism or in injecting new dynamism in the financial sector. So
it sounded like you were stopping there. Which would be perfect, because I don't want you to steal the digital thunder. We'll come back to the digital question. Monique, one of the things that sits in your on your radar is early stage innovation technologies. So to stay away from digital, but to talk about product innovation, ways in which the industry is moving or shifting. There was reference, George, I think it was you talking about the fact that complete absence of product innovation, or you couldn't bring, you used the word, what was your word? I'll get the word. But you had just the word that, you know, if it's a little bit idiosyncratic, it's not allowed, that we don't want anything too imaginative. Some thoughts or ideas on the evidence of innovation, improvements, not the technologies. We're going to do the technologies in a moment.
It's for me.
No, we're coming back to you.
You know, I'm the guy with 48 countries. I have the veto today.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, not one I expected. So, you know, I think as PIC, obviously, Africa is a big part of our portfolio, and we look at it more from an asset allocation perspective. And to be frank, on the technology, early stage innovation space, Africa isn't substantially on our radar yet. And I think that's an important point to understand, because when we're talking about Africa, when we're talking about the value of this index...
These are beautiful flowers. I'm going to move them.
Exactly, because we're dodging over between
it's like that
the
awkward
reeds.
Dinner table conversation.
When we're talking about Africa, when we're talking about benchmarking into Africa, when we're talking about capital allocators and the flow of capital into Africa, the important thing is being able to manage and cost the risk. So when you're talking about an asset class or geography, we already, there's such a diversity, the cost trade-off of understanding the market, understanding the risk is high. Typically, you lean towards more conventional asset classes, your more mature markets, and not your early stage markets. So that's true for us as well. But that is changing globally. We see a lot more interest. There's been a few announcements in terms of early stage investments into Africa. In fact, IFC is committed amount into Capri's new fund, etc. We have a new fund. We've got 30% early stage, and we've got 30% on average allocated into Africa as well from our allocation on the early stage space. But I think what's important from our perspective, PIC as the largest pension fund manager in Africa, when we think about Africa, and why this is significant for us, is because what is key about capital, right? What is key about capital? At what point does it flow? Can I ask the audience?
You can ask the audience. At what point? No, I'm the
yes,
I'm the
you do. Moderate.
At what point? At what point does capital flow?
Does capital flow for a capital allocator?
You've got to shout for returns.
Give me more.
Opportunity. Someone sort of mumbled.
So there needs to be a point of decision.
Thank you.
Right? And what do you need for a point of decision? So think about when you're buying a car. So I had my Ope come. She lives in Diepsloot. She's come into money for the first time. She's made the decision she can buy a car because she's got capital. So now she has to decide what car. So she's looking around and trying to understand all the different cars available.
So she's wrestling with information asymmetry and information gaps.
And she's measuring, right, the risks. Yeah. What is she going to get from the car? And also, where is she getting the information from? And so she explains to us...
reliability.
She explains to us, no, I'm going to get this car from Lesotho because my friend said... I said, you know what, I'm not sure that's credible information to base your first large capital decision on. And that's a bit the same what we face, right, as a large-scale local and international capital allocators. Once you've made the point of decision, you need to have the information that's credible to actually be able to act on that decision. And that's the value that this index brings to us, is because there's credible benchmark information that allows you to span your universe of options to make a decision for the capital to flow. So I think it's quite significant. And when you think about the scalable problems that Africa faces, the solutions that innovation and early stage brings to it, because we have the ability, the innovation to actually make those decisions for ourselves. I think that it's a very exciting space. But in the absence of being able to manage the risks, having credible information to support that. Unfortunately, whether you're talking about early stage or mature stage capital to flow, that becomes very limited.
But in the, not to overcook the point, but the index itself then represents an innovation.
Absolutely.
In the way that it squares up to information gaps, knowledge deficits, and so on.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the makeup that surprises you, that I don't think they should be there, or wow, who would have guessed?
Yeah, I had a few of those moments. Actually, what stood out for me more in this, what I would have loved to have seen, if you go to one of the summary pillars where those bar graphs are, is I would love actually to have seen a benchmark against an EM and a global average.
Oh.
Because you know what I bet? We kind of tend to underestimate ourselves in Africa. I bet some of those high-ranking countries would actually exceed an EM average in some instances. So there's a challenge. I don't know. That may take a whole army of people.
So that we could be squaring up to some Latin American, East European.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, the other value of this index, right, is that you create internal tension and competition. Aren't we all just driven that way? Amongst the countries, which is fantastic. A knowledge share, knowledge gaining on how did they get there? What did they do? You know, we don't have to redo the wheel here. And reinvent the wheel here. But also, once you bring in a global element, let's raise the bar. You know, we don't only need to benchmark ourselves against African, but let's raise the bar and see, you know, where are we heading to? So that for me would have been just very interesting.
Garth, I promise I'll come to you.
Ladies deserve it. Save the best for last.
If this is about building content, developing understanding, this has to feed your world.
It absolutely does, and it feeds my soul as well. I feel like I've spent the last literally 4 years. I met George. He doesn't know that I met him, though. Launching the first index. And I was super excited a year ago when this index came out, and I'm actually kicking myself at the time because I would love to have been more involved, but I now know now's my opportunity. Yes, as a global data provider, I spend a large proportion of my time taking African data to the world and making sure that the world is able to interpret that data in such a way that we are able to do a lot of that benchmarking. But I think we're in a really unique situation right now because I actually think that we are starting to be at a place where we've got enough data. And I never thought I would say that,
wow.
But I think we've got to start. There's just so much data coming online, and you've alluded to a couple of things around innovation, and I think just with a lot of that space picking up across Africa, there is unique data sets coming online, but people and companies don't necessarily know what the data is that they're sitting on. And I think that we're at a place where using this analysis to help capacitate financial markets is extremely interesting in terms of helping people dissect that data into, yes, the competition. So we're driving change for the next index, but also what data is missing. So I love the way that George used, and I'm talking a lot about the sort of, yes, there's a lot of quantitative data, and I'm definitely going to speak to Danae about the interactive data map, because I've got some ideas. But what about that unstructured sentence of the comparability of countries, and how do we start integrating that into our analysis and the data sets that people are sitting on that we can integrate into this to overlay this and actually help with things that don't just talk to country risk ranking, but also starting to look at township level ranking and demographics that we're actually starting to work with corporates on.
So intra-country, regional. It really is, that's a cool idea. Your point about the information or data that this starts to make available reminds me of an observation made by Morton Jervin, who is leader in understanding the availability, reliability of data in Africa. And at one point, up until fairly recently, I'll guess the date is about 2005, 2007, Uganda measured its export performance by asking Kenya. Because that was the export, so if we can get from there 10, 12 years ago to this, I mean, that really is a step change. And I think you have to be applauded for this fantastic contribution, which means you should applaud. If there's any component of this that you think will feed the appetite or hunger of news readers, news users?
So there's two overlays I would add. One that actually stems on my understanding of how the PIC does a lot of their investment decision making. And an element that intrigued me, because I've been quite close to it recently with a lot of the stock exchanges that we work with, as it pertains to financial standards and reporting standards. But I'd like to stretch it a step further and encourage large pension funds to work with exchanges to discuss sustainability metrics. Because I'm desperately in need of more companies starting to disclose those metrics, because I think that it starts to talk into the sustainability of this model and us feeding our own continent. So that's one I would love to see more of.
Garth, actually, I'll still come to you. So, Monique, you could have always said to your au pair about the Lesotho car, well, I know a guy who's just been there. I'll be on a panel with him tonight. You have been to Lesotho?
Yeah.
Okay.
Indeed.
Garth, as head of markets, perhaps you've been head of market headaches, given some of the recent experiences. And if we flip right to the end of the deck, can we flip there? It's pillar 6, I think.
Yeah, very important one.
Is that our one? That's it there.
Yeah.
I guess this is an awkward conversation to anchor or to ground, but if we look at the performance of the sub-Saharan economies over the past 15 years, there was a time during which there were some real superstars that caught international attention. You interact with these clients' markets on a day-to-day basis, and they went from being superstars to real headaches in the space of a year, a few months, punctuated by global financial crisis and collapsing commodity prices. And you quickly found these fast-growing economies had dried up of currency. You couldn't exchange with them. Contracts were unenforceable or hard to enforce. And if I look at this almost looks like it's a bipolar or two-legged animal, that there's one part that's robust and contractable, and there's another part that's got work to do.
That's right. It's feast or famine in Africa. So if I go back before we actually designed this index, I was in the US speaking to about 80 real money managers. And they were fascinated. They were interested in, they had lots of questions. And my busiest time was actually after the presentation, because everyone kind of stormed me and said, look, we're about 50% invested in Africa according to the allocated benchmark or money that we should invest. We just don't know how to do it. We had many conversations, but one of the investors said to me, I like Africa. I'm just not sure if it's a 5-year or a 100-year trade. And having worked in the financial markets day to day, whereby sometimes you can get something done and sometimes you can't get something done, I was too impatient for it to be a 100-year trade. And being an African who sees the risk premium or one of the fastest growing items in the fiscal budget to be the expense line of interest, it's wrong that Africa should pay such a risk premium for raising money. And it's devastational on what they can actually spend to build infrastructure. So, I came back and I said to Georgia and to Jeff, we have to find a way to be a catalyst to change the capital markets, to make sure it becomes more of a 5-year trade than a 100-year trade. And we have to find a way to let people to know what they should work on that is a priority to reduce the risk premium, so that people can end up, A, raising more money, but at a far cheaper price to do a lot more with. When we traveled around Africa and tried to speak on behalf of foreign investors or local investors, we would have to beg to get interviews and appointments and meetings with policymakers, central banks, finance ministers, and it was just too slow. It was too difficult, and when you try to explain what you're doing, someone always thought that you had an agenda. So when we created this index to shine what I call the spotlight on the go-to things to make it a 5-year trade and reduce risk premium, suddenly we got the phone calls. Come and see us. Come and teach us what we don't know or what we need to prioritize to do with a limited budget to make the greatest step forward. And I think that we're on this journey and we're getting there, and OMFIF's independence and credibility makes it possible that people don't see us as with a hidden agenda, but actually suddenly see this as a possibility to increase their bars in every category. And I believe that the international investors absolutely want to allocate money to Africa. They want to partner with local corporates. They want to see the local investment community thrive and participate in their own capital markets development. So I think the internationals absolutely are using this in their research as well, and it's very beneficial for countries.
So in your comment on talking about investor appetite or interest in the continent, you make the point about Africa, and what this lays bare, if we ever need any more evidence, but what it lays bare is how varied and differentiated places are, and that a country can be exceptional in one aspect and have a lot of work to do in another component. So I think the richness in this tool is immediately apparent, and it also flags the gaps, as you point out. And here is a glaring gap. In going through the report, another gap that stands out to me, and perhaps I can ask each of you for your thoughts on this, another gap that really stands out for me is the prospect of regional integration that's available, but overwhelmingly seems to be looked past. Some thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I mean, huge. So that's one of the areas we focus on as well when we look at investment strategies. Are there South African markets and are there regional opportunities in Africa? And how do you best allocate capital to unlock those, whether it's the value chains, whether it's thematically around the food security. We are the hubs where you can link up land with processing capacity, with market access, etc. So I think that there's a massive opportunity there as well through this to help join the dots of where the opportunities are. So that if you, for example, solve a liquidity issue on an exchange, for example, in this country, you unlock a regional problem, or an infrastructure bottleneck in this area, you unlock 5 of the challenges. Yeah, I would completely agree. There's massive potential there to try and draw out from that regional opportunities.
I think it's a willingness to share, I would say. So we've been working on a project which is called the African Exchange Link Project, and it links, it's due to working with ASIA, which is the African Stock Exchange Association, to link 6 exchanges. And it's been an extremely interesting element of understanding what the differences are between those exchanges and the willingness to cooperate and work together. but actually realizing that they're not necessarily talking to the right stakeholders.
Can I interrupt? Without giving away any state secrets, is there a sense of they're very willing, or are they?
No, very willing. No, very willing.
Okay.
And I think that came out in the report in terms of exchanges creating opportunities to create a network effect. And I think it's about that inter-regional sharing again, and knowing that across 6 countries, stockbrokers in those 6 countries know their markets extremely well, but actually may have better relationships with certain international fund managers, but are able to share that narrative across the markets really well. So simple things like fixed technology. The Nigerians scored really well off the back of enhancing some of their technology innovation to direct market access into
And
their
those
markets.
are easy wins.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I stopped you, guys.
Sorry.
So I think in terms of being regionally beneficial for the African markets, I think for that slide, pillar 6, what regional or independent countries must do and realize is that they can't throw their own piece of independent flavor into legal frameworks. They actually need to agree there's a common set of legal principles. You can't have a GIBS for East Africa that's completely different to West Africa to what the rest of the world uses. And regional benefits of common documentation and understanding is really beneficial, I think, for the economies to really do well. There are some things you can keep as uniquely independent, and you should celebrate those things. But what I see is the attempt to keep a little piece of legislation that's unique to what everyone else is doing is actually very dangerous, because it just confuses the investors. They no longer quite know what is good or how it will work in a court of law, how they get recourse. And then that just makes the investment choice so much more difficult. And I think people must understand that homogeneous or regional equivalents, especially in your capital markets, are very important. And you can't be bespoke and unique in your collateral frameworks, etc.
So a drive to harmonization, coordination, common language.
Absolutely. You know, people like ISDA have figured it out. You don't need to deviate from the standard ISDA documentation, or if there's a breach and you want to have recourse to your collateral, how that works. We actually need to get regional consensus on how that should work.
I thought ISLA was a person. I don't know what ISLA is.
Oh. So some tech conversation.
They know what ISLA, or many know what ISLA is. What is it referred to?
ISDA.
ISDA stands for?
It's International Standard Derivatives documentation that we.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Adrian, if I may just touch on a point that you made around the sustainability measurement. So that is a bit of a bee in my bonnet as well. And so I just wanted to come back to that point. So I would completely agree that one of the areas for Africa that increasingly is important is a much greater understanding of all of the sustainability, developmental, responsible, whatever term you want to use around it, ESG, really impact measurement tools that's available in Africa. Because there is, sorry if this is very colloquial language, but just money sloshing around, waiting to find a home to make impact. And half our problem in Africa is that we haven't been able to quantify it and communicate that in a way that people can access in a credible way. And so I would love that, because I was last week, I was in India at the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing in India, and one of the key themes that came up there was around measurement. And, you know, from the Sustainable Development Goals, they talk about the $2 trillion that's needed to solve it. And really what comes through time and time again is our inability to measure it, and therefore capital cannot flow to those areas because capital allocators can't measure the outcome of impact. And so I think when we think about the value of this index, how it can ultimately benefit Africa and its unique challenges, I think that element needs to possibly come through stronger.
Because
in the
there's an
system.
opportunity to pull out from, I think it's pillar 5, I'm just flipping through here, but your inclusion or your impact components, those
a
can
larger, element focusing on that.
Riyad, you didn't get to talk about regional.
Okay, I think, I spent the last 12 years working in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Africa in general, and across the world. So when you look at the African country, I think we have lots of advantage. The problem is that we are not able to have an integrated strategic approach to pull all the pillars together in the same way. So example, when you take the West Africa, the MOU zone, in how many regions we have such an easy union? Where in 8 countries you have the same currency, people can move without any visas, without any constraints, goods can move. And if you invest in one country as a financial institution, you can open subsidiaries in the other 7 countries. And you have access to 100 million people in one shot. How many? Yeah, I am from Tunisia. North Africa, we never succeed even to agree on the basis. I'm still need visa to travel. My father is Algerian, my mom is Tunisian, and I still need visa to go from one country to another, or at least I need passport. So the problem is that we have, I think on the capital markets and other stuff, but we have lots of work that was already done to facilitate the regional integration. Let's take one sector. I took one zone. Let's take the cocoa sector, for example. The value chain, it's an agri-value chain. Agri is important in Africa. It's 30% of the GDPs, 60-70% of the employment creation, but only 3% attractive of the capital from the banks, or from the financial sector. It's really a main topic on how we can, and if you take the cocoa, you find in Cote d'Ivoire the same players. You go to Ghana and other countries, important for the cocoa worldwide, you find the same ecosystem, the same financial player, the same financial tools, the same anchors in the agri, international and local. You go to Cameroon, you find them the same. So it's easy, if you like, to develop one sector, multi-countries in Africa. And there is a lot of willingness. You know, I was able to improve the framework in at least 26 countries in less than 2 years. There's a lot of willingness from the government in many, many countries in Africa, and the rest is really exception. There's a lot of willingness to improve their legal framework, to improve their financial sector, to improve the pillar number 6, the credibility on the legal system, which is crucial to attract investment. The problem that there is a lot of lack of capacities and capabilities to do it. And this kind of initiative is fantastic, because it's not only you are not sharing indexes, you are sharing learning. The way on how you can move from number 20 to number 10 to number 15. And those are the questions that the people we put on the place. What is Pillar 5 and there's a lot of very positive competition. We at the World Bank Group, we implemented years ago what we call the doing business, with the aim to improve the business environment framework, and it became a reference. So all the countries, they are fighting to improve the doing business, and then the investors really become a reference. And I'm sure that this Findex, it will become a reference soon, if it's not already one of the things that the investors look at it. So what we are trying, I am part of the International Finance Corporation. We are part of the World Bank Group. So one of the things that we try to do to try to address number 5, macroeconomic instability is important for investors, and number 6, which is very crucial, the credibility of the legal system in terms of enforcement. We try to give our AAA credibilities to go to the countries and give guarantee to local players, to partners with international players through raising funding or whatever kind of partnership. So we try to do it, and I believe if you give some numbers, it's not really the topic to talk about IFC today, but if we give some numbers, from 2009, we invested in Africa like $8 billion. In 2028, we invest $4 billion in local currency to help the capital market, through a demonstration. What is $4 billion? It's nothing when you look at the needs, but at least we can do the demonstration effect that people can trust. And if you bring someone, give them the guarantee, put your AAA rates on the table, and then they stay there for 3-4 years, and then they learn the market, and then it becomes another story. But there is a lot of good, I believe, prerequisite for a more regional growth. You know, I moved to South Africa 2 years ago. I all the times ask myself, I'm from the North Africa. I ask myself, I said that if South Africa looks to Africa in terms of economic opportunity, they will double the GDP. In this country, it's like, in agriculture, it's huge. In financial sector, it's one of the best, not in Africa. I think if you put South Africa in this ranking globally, they will not be far from the top 3.
Yeah.
The insurance sector, I don't think that you can find a better performing insurance sector outside of South Africa worldwide. Go to London financial market and you will hear the same topic. If a country like South Africa rethink and reposition themselves versus Africa, I think that the 30% unemployment could be addressed in a limited numbers of years. The other thing is that, and I really appreciate when you raise it, any African countries, it's not one country. Like Africa is not one continent. You go to Ghana, Accra is one story. 3 hours from Accra, it's many stories. Not one story. And this is what I said, you know. This is what I said that, you know, if you leave Johannesburg by car,
local knowledge.
if you leave Johannesburg by car, 12 hours, it's all the times good roads, you can find where you eat, decent food, when you sleep, decent place, etc., etc. This is what I call an integrated infrastructure capabilities to help any economist, boom, to move up. I think what we miss in South Africa, and it's not a pretension on my side, I just feel part of this country since I moved here, it's really to look at Africa as a real business opportunity and move, guys, and you will see what you will do to this country. And you have one of the strongest financial capabilities and capital capabilities in terms of market.
Wow.
So this is all about the regional, and the regional, it's similar to the countries, the capital city, and the rural area. And this is why I think financial inclusion topic is an important. Financial inclusion topic bring the importance of including the rural people in rural area in the financial space. Because without impacting them, you will never be able to improve your financial inclusion.
Where places like South Africa, Angola have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and in different ways, because those are two extremes.
Those are my best questions. I'm sure that there are some thoughts, ideas, challenges, clarifications from the room. If I could ask you if you do have a question or comment, to please keep it short and to identify yourself. We've got all the way at the back. Yeah. Have we got a mic? Yeah. So won't you go up to the back first? Thank you. Or you can shout and I'll repeat it.
Thank you. Arnold Sego with the CNBC Africa. So first of all, I like that there's someone here from the World Bank, because usually when you get many of these indices, we saw what happened with Paul Romer, former chief economist of the World Bank Group, calling it quits because he disagreed with the Doing Business report and what Chile had to say. Danae, what are you doing to make sure that this does not become another index where maybe the results are predetermined? My apologies to our representative from the World Bank Group. And my second question, very brief of course, is if you look at the IMF's regional economic outlook that just came out last week and track I think it's on the last page, broad money as a percentage of GDP, it actually covers most of this. And if you cross-examine it with your findings here, arguably the results are the same. Danae, maybe you could just give us a sense of what the deviation could be, looking at broad money as a percentage of GDP for the African continent vis-a-vis this particular index. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions so that we can get some efficiencies. We've got one at the front here.
Thank you. My name is Armel from Quartile Capital. My question to the panel relates to Pillar 4. You see South Africa with a score of 95, and I mean the closest competitor is 65. What do you think are some of the the simple and practical steps that the other nations can follow just to boost the capacity of the local investors?
Thank you.
Siba with Absa Capital. I have a more simple question. Politics plays a huge role for investor sentiments, particularly looking at Mozambique 2016 when there was undisclosed funding or debt rather for the government, and that's played a huge role in terms of investor sentiments around the country. Kenya, there's an investment cap. Local clients can't really invest that much because there's a cap on debt. So I just want to find out, those decisions that are made by politicians, how have you guys factored that into the pillars, or rather the index as a whole?
Great. And 4 is, we've got one here. Come to you, Tess.
Hi, thank you. My name is Thabo Mukate from EBS Advisory. My question is, as I'm looking at the methodology, you say all the indicators are weighted equally and the pillars are weighted equally. Surely there are some things that are more important than others. I mean, when I listen to George, it seems like legal enforcement is a key thing. And if I think of my own, and I'm sure you would all have different things that you'd say, no, pillar 1 or pillar 2. So how did you come to make them all the same? Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I'm going to break protocol and I'm going to go off panel because I think some of these questions, are you guys okay just commenting? Yeah. What am I going to do first? So South Africa scores 95, others score 65. What are the practical things that can be done here as readers, users, builders? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, so I think capacity building is important. So, for example, I met a colleague from Ghana and also setting up an early stage VC fund, and she was just sharing how difficult it is to get professionals to get experience in the market when the market is underdeveloped, and asked very specifically, can she send some of her team to come and learn and information share. So I think that's some of the more practical things, for example, in the financial services space is a more proactivity in actual just sharing of expertise and experience sets and transferring of knowledge and allowing time of our African colleagues to come, especially in the fund management community. I think where we are very insular. There's a massive opportunity there for those.
And there's budgets for that in international agencies also,
yes,
alongside domestic capability.
I can add something to that, and it's on the theme of education. So we were in Kenya, and we wondered why no one had bought the gold ETF in Kenya. It had been a huge success in South Africa.
Yeah.
And we spoke to a lot of people who manage money, and they all said, we'd love to buy it, but our trustees don't allow us to. Huh. And so we queried that a little bit, and the reality is, I think the people who hold the power actually have a huge role to play in developing the local investor base. And I don't believe that they're actually good custodians of developing their own markets. And we need to actually check the level of education that these people have in terms and knowledge. And I don't mean this in a demeaning way.
Yeah, but it's a great provocation.
We need to equip them with understanding what is possible, what other people have done, and actually spark some innovation in them. There are $200 billion or more of African invested money offshore. And it breaks my heart that Africa is investing developed economies at ridiculously low yielding returns for those investors. And I think that if the products were described better by the people who are responsible for developing this market and explaining to local investors and giving them confidence by legal frameworks and by what the politicians say, I think that $200 billion will come back and it'll be sitting back in Africa, And that's exactly the ammunition that local investors need to build and capacitate the industry quite a lot.
I have to watch our time on the clock at the back. That's my barometer. Can I come to you guys and ask you for quick thoughts on practical things that can be done?
Yeah, so I think fully support what has already been said about investor education. That is absolutely critical. The other parts which we've seen, which comes through the ranking quite clearly, is the issue of liberalization of the pension sector across the market. So you'll see that the first 5 countries are countries that have pension sectors that are liberalized, and liberalization forces competition, forces better returns on pension assets and growth, right? And then the other countries are countries where liberalization hasn't really happened. Okay, so you take a country like Uganda, where the government underwrites pension risk. There is no liberalized pension sector. It's a constraint on building local capacity of investors because there is absolutely no participation or very minimum participation from local investors. So liberalization is one, which is, we believe is a low-hanging fruit. The other one is just making it easy for local investors to access local products. So it's been said that in Africa, it's easier for a local investor to buy investment outside Africa than to buy investment within their own market because the structure of the settlement process, acquisition of equities and bonds is just so difficult. It's not convenient. And I think that is also a big opportunity for policymakers to really direct efforts towards making it easy for people to access the capital market. Those are 2 things that, in addition to education, are critical in actually boosting that side.
And then point to the idiosyncrasies then. As much as it's difficult to invest outside, you've got initiatives or efforts like Emakiba, the Kenyan bond, where you can buy on your smart device an infrastructure bond for 3,000 shillings.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is a very good example on how this was a test by the government, how digital capabilities can unlock some issues to help the local market investors when they are not big players, because we see a lot of important local investor easily participating in the capital market, but the majority of the potential investment, they could be the types of segment that was targeted by Makiba, where almost $500 a ticket, and it was closed, I think, $35 million in 10 days.
Yeah, yeah. If, who wants to do the politics getting in the way? Anyone want that one?
Look, we will.
Here's my go-to guy.
I think we will never stop politics making decisions for different reasons. What impressed me is the capacity of the private sector to innovate. So look, when you take the interest cap rate in Kenya, in the same times you find, Kenya, it's 80% financial inclusion countries. It's one of the largest. It's one of the most innovative. When you look at the financial inclusion rate in South Africa and Kenya, it's similar, the same, but in countries where the financial infra is totally different. So in Kenya, they were able to perform thanks to the digital capabilities they developed at the economy level and at the financial market specifically. So what they are trying to do is, we, the World Bank and the IFC, we try to address this kind of issue. It's part of our role to go and talk to the government and share benchmark, and we try to represent the voice of the private sector to address these kind of challenges. But in the same time, as I see, and we work with many banks and with many mobile money players to help them through the digital, reducing the operational cost, reducing the fundraising cost, because you cannot imagine, in Africa, we implemented not investment, advisory project in 13 countries, including countries like DRC, like Liberia, Sierra Leone. And the data that we collected through those 13 countries, through the digital financial services advisory, not even investment, we were able to help our partners, banks, financial institutions, microfinance, to increase the client outreach by 11.2 million and to improve the volume of transaction per year by $5 billion. So you cannot imagine how important the small ticket and the small investors in our economies, because we can imagine at the end of the day, because if the economy is represented by 80% in the informal, so you can imagine that there is a huge liquidity, not tracked by the classic financial market, and through digital we can pull all that money to the financial sector if it's done in a very strategic way.
And the sector displays ability to innovate around some of these interruptions or interferences, evidently. Janae,
yes,
you're going to tell us about the broad money.
I'll pass that question to my colleague Jeff, actually, but I'll comment first on the other question from the gentleman from CNBC Africa, and also to say thank you to the panel, excellent contributions, and also thank you for giving us homework from incorporating the digital element of the index to doing more work on the data bank to spreading it to more countries. I think we'll go away with many ideas, so thank you to the panel. But on your question about the risks and the comparison with the ease of doing business index with the World Bank, it's a great compliment for us to be compared to this index, because it's also what we're aiming to do, to have this as a useful tool for the policymakers. And I think if it does become a tool and policymakers engage with it and look at which policies to improve, I think that is a step in the right direction. We don't want it to be a box-ticking exercise where they prioritize the policies just to climb up the index. As much as we like to draw attention to the index, we think it's an indication of where the effort should focus, and that's why we're working with the policymakers. So now we're going to take it to the different markets, and when we did the roadshows last year, it was really useful for us to see policymakers saying, this is really useful to us. They even asked us to do it more frequently than once a year. But also is about maintaining that independence and getting the view both from the investors and the governments. This is what I spoke about in the very beginning. And that's where the survey element comes in. We listen to both sides, and it's not being biased towards the policymakers or towards the markets. It's creating a credible, independent index that serves both sides in terms of where efforts should be concentrated, but also when you're looking to invest as an investor, what are the different elements across the different pillars. And I'll pass to Jeff to talk about the broad money. Yes.
This is an African, this is an African initiative. This is one of the unique African initiatives.
Africanacity.
To index our market. So don't forget that.
If I'm just anxious about our time. We've made a commitment to a deadline. So, George, can I ask you to do Jeff, a 5-word
just
answer?
Very quick around broad money. The question was, could we not get the same ordering by looking at sort of a very simple macro indicator? And I don't know, we'd have to look at it, you might do, but it misses the whole point of the index. The whole point of the index is not the ordinal ranking. The point of the index is the 40 factors that we look in there so countries can have a discussion about what they're doing well, what they're doing less well, and critically, and to bring it back to this point around an African index, it's not us comparing ourselves to Southeast Asia or Latin America. It's African countries and regulators being able to learn from other African countries and regulators. And that's a sort of discussion that we haven't had as a continent before. We're accustomed to people flying in from Washington and from London and from Hong Kong and others to talk to us about what we should be doing. Yeah. This is an opportunity for us as Africans to discuss within ourselves what's working well, what we can learn from one another, and as a continent uplift ourselves. And that's where I think broad money isn't going to do it.
Yeah. Thank you. I know that there are more questions. It's my job to manage time. And we've gone past our close date. I'm going to invite you to join us outside on the lawn for dinner and for conversation. If your questions have been put, or if you've got burning questions, Tess, please come and find the panelists or the authors. It's my job to thank each of the panelists for your contributions. Monique, Candice, Garth, Riyadh, thank you for your insights, your contributions. To the index authors, thank you. Please join us for food and conversation. Thank you.